Hi guys, welcome back to Swordwind. We are the Charlotte branch of the New York Historical Fencing Association. My name is Eric Lowe, and in this video we're going to be looking at how to hold Vom Tag and some of the ways that can go wrong. In this series of videos about the major guards in the early KDF tradition, that I'm going to be presenting guards in sort of the opposite order that Lichtenauer actually presents them in the Zettel. The reason for that is because although, as I discussed in my introductory video, guards are primarily conceived of in the early KDF tradition as a way to analyze your opponent's openings. Nevertheless, we do need ourselves a place to start from. The guards do serve that purpose, even if it's not the pedagogical emphasis in early Lichtenauer. And most, at least the way that we teach here at Swordwind, most plays are taught starting from Vom Tag. We'll get into the reasons for that a little bit later, but right now let's just look at the guard. What I have here is my default cutting grip, as we discussed in our grip video at length. My sword is over my shoulder, not in front of, not at, over my shoulder, at about the height of my ear. My cutting grip is maintained in the guard. I still have contact at the base of both palms with the narrow edge of my grip. The blade is angled up and away from my body, so that the blade almost kind of wants to tilt back in my grip, and I can get this nice finger squeeze here. And my hips are oriented such that whichever side of my body my sword is on, the opposite leg is advanced. So here my sword is on my right side, my dominant side, and my left leg, my non-dominant leg, starts advanced. You'll notice that my elbows are close to the body. They are hanging down, and they are hanging down kind of at a comfortable angle. So this is what the guard looks like. Now, let's talk about some ways that this can go wrong. And again, when I say wrong, I'm talking about wrong for a particular biomechanical or pedagogical reason, not necessarily wrong in the sense of historically inaccurate. The first way that this can go wrong is that my hips are not tucked under my body. This is not something that is specific to Vom Tag, but it's worth pointing out. Posture is an important part of your guards. My posture is frankly only fair to middling. I have a tendency to stand kind of with my butt pointed back. I don't know if this is the way I was born or if it's just years of bad ergonomics. But when you are fencing, if you are like me and your hips are not aligned with your torso naturally, give yourself a nice pelvic thrust so that your hips are aligned with your torso. That's important because when we go to swing our hips, we want the axis of the hips to actually be in the plane or in the axis of all the rest of our body that is swinging. If I stand like this and try to swing my hips, then it's not going to be as connected to what my upper body is doing. Second thing we want to make sure is that we're not kind of hunched forward. A lot of people, especially if you work office jobs like me, have this issue. Whatever mental hack you need to do to kind of bring your chest forward and your shoulders back so that you stand like you're actually, you stand in a kind of a more natural position, go ahead and do that. But I want to point out that this is not good fencing posture. And the reason for that is very similar. This disconnects the movement of the upper body from what is hopefully the good biomechanics that are going on down here. So hips forward, chest forward, shoulders back, right? I'm not saying that you need to kind of throw your chest forward, but take note of your own posture in a mirror. Make sure that you're not kind of standing naturally like this, up, shoulders back to where they should be, hips tucked in, and then we're ready to go. Second thing that can go wrong here is that your grip might be off. It's relatively easy to establish your default cutting grip down here in long point. When you bring it up, there's a tendency for this bottom hand to rotate in. I hope you can see that in the camera. Here, I may not notice that I've done that as I brought my hand up. The reason that this sometimes happens is because it's more in line with the angle of my non-dominant hand. But I need to be sure that I have heel of the palm contact with my non-dominant hand, even in a guard, especially if it's a cutting guard. That is to say that it's threatening primarily with the edge. Another way that this oftentimes goes wrong is that the hilt is not at the proper place above the shoulder. That could be either down here, or it's too low. A good rule of thumb is that your Vom Tag should be held high enough that you can poke yourself in the ear with the thumb of your dominant hand. That's not to say that you should actually poke yourself in the ear, although if you want to check, go ahead. But it should be at basically that level. This is something to keep note of, especially when you are fencing in gear. The kinesthetic feedback from all of the padding we wear in fencing jackets under our armpits tends to make you think, if you're not careful, that you're up here when in fact you're down here. There's really no way to get around that in a fencing jacket other than to kind of feel what it feels like when you've got all that extra padding here. Look at yourself in the mirror or have a partner look at you and tell you where your hands are, right? Especially when you're fencing in gear, jack those hands way back, even if it feels weird under your arms at first. Then, speaking of which, right, just as we don't want to do this, we don't want to have the hilt actually forward of our shoulder. The reason for that is because it naturally advances the hands and forearms as a target. And in this guard, there is no, because our point is not in line, there's no piece of steel stopping an opponent from just cutting your forearm off. If you fight up here, you are saying, cut my forearms off. Now, there may be reasons that you are doing that. Maybe you're trying to bait your opponent into cutting your forearm so that you can take it away, turn his strike into something that's out of distance, and then cut a return strike according to the principle of Nachreisen, as we say in the early KDF tradition. But this is something you should only ever do deliberately. If your kind of default version of Vom Tag keeps the hands and the forearms back as far out of the way of your opponent's danger zone as possible. So not here, certainly not down here. This is both low and kind of unnecessarily forearm advanced. This is, by the way, speaking of fighting in gear, this is something that you need to be very aware of, especially if you are beginning to spar for the first time and you have all of this extra padding on. Your heat retention situation is totally different. You will get tired, and the tendency is for your Vom Tag to creep further forward and further down as you get exhausted, right? I understand that. It happens to everybody, but it's something that you should be aware of, especially when you are fighting in gear for the first time. Finally, let's talk about the elbows. We don't want my elbows are kind of comfortably loose and down. That's in contrast to two things. One is in contrast to keeping your elbows out, right? Now the problem here is twofold. One, it breaks my nice cutting grip unless I am really kind of doing something very weird with my hands. That's actually, in my opinion, the main problem. The somewhat less, somewhat more minor problem is that it naturally advances the forearms as targets, particularly of your forward arm. Now, I have been struck on my right forearm when doing this. It does happen. I don't think it's especially likely that somebody's going to kind of, unless they're left-handed, get far enough to your outside to cut this forearm off. But it's there's no point in leaving it out as a target. The loose, the kind of comfortably loose down elbows are also in contrast to tucking your elbows in. The problem here is that I've contracted all of the muscles around my face, my shoulders, my neck, and I am cramping my I am cramping my ability to smoothly extend forward the way we want to for a long range and powerful cut. This is something that I personally tend to see mostly in students who have previous empty hand experience. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because empty hand combat, especially empty hand combat sports, is a very different sort of wounding situation than fighting with an edged weapon. You can, to some extent at least, kind of brace your face and your neck, and therefore your brain, against empty hand blows to the head. You cannot brace any of that against a sword strike. Sword edge doesn't really care how tense your neck muscles are, or your shoulders or anything like that. So in sword combat, if you have kind of for whatever reason, a tendency to kind of cramp up here, force yourself to relax, force yourself to get back into that nice open, connected posture, right? You fight from here. Now let's talk about variation. First off, let's talk about why this is kind of my preferred default version of the guard. As we've already discussed a little bit, Vom Tag doesn't present any steel in front of you. Now that's not to say that it doesn't present a threat, right? If you walk up to somebody like this, some part of their monkey brain is going to say, wow, that guy's going to bring that 3-foot piece of steel down onto my head. But there is no physical object between the opponent and your body. For that reason, as we've already discussed, we want the hands to be kept, the hands and the forearms to be kept nice and far back. The other thing, so what does this guard do, right? It's not a particularly protective position. Anything we can do to defend ourselves requires a movement of some sort. There is steel between the opponent and the right side of our head, right? If someone were to strike around this way, there's metal in the way. But you'll notice that I'm not braced, my joints are not braced in any way to absorb that impact. If somebody were to strike, for instance, a high horizontal blow over here and they meant it, this is going to prevent them from splitting my skull open, which is not the worst result, but it's also going to smash this piece of steel into my ear, ring my bell really good. It's going to be very uncomfortable, probably going to disorient or stun me. And so ultimately, from a fighting perspective, even though I may not die immediately, this is, fairly poor protection, even in the plane where there is steel between me and the opponent. The virtue of Vom Tag is that the blade is already in the plane of a cut. I can do this without any kind of preparatory motion. You contrast that with other guards. For instance, if I'm down here in long point, there is steel between me and my opponent, and there's a measure of safety there. but I can't cut from here without first cocking my blade back to some extent. It may not be all the way up into Vom Tag here, but there will be some telegraphic motion before I cut. That's not to say that you should never cut from point-oriented guards, but the point of this guard is that the plane is already in the edge of a cut. The edge is already in the plane of a cut. You can cut without any telegraphic motion, and therefore, in effect, your cuts from here are quicker than they would be from another guard, particularly a point-oriented guard. That is the virtue of Vom Tag. As a result, if your blade is not actually in the plane of a cut, your Vom Tag is sort of useless, even if it may definitionally speaking be Vom Tag. That's the reason why I don't want people to practice holding their Vom Tag down here, because here, either I pop up so that I can extend fully, or I cut like this, and my cut is shortened. Shortness, as we've discussed in our fundamentals videos, also translates into less cutting power as much as it translates into shortened range. Similarly down here, either I pop up telegraphically or I cut like this. Again, very short range, very comparatively weak cue. Let me pause here, by the way, and point out that I am not suggesting anybody ever eat a sword strike on the theory that it won't do that much damage. That's just dumb. However, as the person throwing the strike, you want your hue to do as much damage as you are capable of putting out. So while this is the sort of threat that somebody should respond to, right? I'm not just going to stand there and say, it's pretty weak hue, go ahead and hit me and I'm going to, like, you know, shank you in return, or just take that and then split your skull open. That's a dumb idea. However, as the person throwing the hue, I don't want my opponent to have the physical capability to respond, right? I don't want to deal them a wound that they're going to spend months recovering from. I don't want to deal them a wound that is going to be ultimately mortal. I want to deal them a wound that leaves them physically unable to strike an afterblow. So going back to the purpose of Vom Tag, right? Make sure that whatever Vom Tag you hold, your blade is in the plane of the cut that you intend to throw. Let me point out one more thing about this that occurs to me. I forgot to mention blade angle. You'll see that my blade here is kind of pointed generically up and back over my shoulder. The reason for that, as we discussed before, is so that I have enough play in my fingers to get this nice finger squeeze and accelerate my tip and all of the things that that does for a cut. It is possible to cut from here, but the reason I don't like this as a default Vom Tag is because it doesn't give my fingers any play. So let's talk more now about what Vom Tag is for as opposed to what it is. Definitionally speaking, Vom Tag is any guard in which you are threatening your opponent with the edge and your hands are above the natural waist. So this is Vom Tag, 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 this is Vom Tag. All of these things have my hands above my waist, that is in the upper openings, to use KDF terminology, and they are threatening my opponent with the edge. From the perspective of somebody facing a guard, that is all I need to know to shorten my decision loop. I don't need to spend a lot of time, if I face somebody in this guard, I don't need to spend a lot of time and cede the initiative to my opponent while I am thinking, gosh, I've never seen that before, what can he do from there? Now, if I have seen that guard before and I know exactly what he can do from there, all the better. But if it's totally new to me and I need to make a snap decision right now as to how I'm going to attack this person, then thinking of this as just another species of Vom Tag lets me stay in the fight rather than backing off and ceding the initiative while I try and figure out what that position is for. The fact that all of these things are Vom Tag, though, does not mean that they are all equally functional. Some of them are functional in fairly specific instances. For instance, like this kind of guard or this kind of guard, certainly attested in historical manuals, some of which are even in the KDF tradition itself. I'm not aware of anybody like adopting this kind of guard, and it doesn't seem very functional to me. Just to emphasize that the fact that I teach students this as kind of the default Vom Tag does not mean it is the only Vom Tag. It is certainly not the only historical Vom Tag. It is certainly not the only functional Vom Tag. So let's talk about a couple of other ways in which we do teach variations of Vom Tag that I think are functional and sort of worthwhile practicing all the time. The first is just moving the sword from your dominant shoulder to your non-dominant shoulder. You'll see here I have switched which foot is advanced. The sword's on my left side now, my non-dominant side, so my right foot, my dominant foot is advanced. Other than that, the only thing I have done is moved my hands without changing their orientation to the left side of my head. My grip is the same, my height is the same, everything going on here in the pelvis and the shoulders is the same. And that's pretty much all there is to say about this. One way in which you sometimes see this go wrong, especially with very, very new students, is they will try to rotate their wrists like this because they have some idea that the thumb should stay, next to their ear or something like that. Or sometimes you see people doing this. Without getting into I have seen people advocate for this particular grip. For purposes of this video and kind of my opinions on beginner pedagogy, I would say keep the wrists behind the edge, don't rotate them so your knuckles are facing the opponent, both of your wrists are behind your edge, so that when you cut, you have a nice strong structure without having to do a whole bunch of complicated handwork or add different body mechanics to your cut. The last variation that we use quite often is up here over the head. Again, right, this is Vom Tag, this is Vom Tag, this is Vom Tag, this is Vom Tag, this is Vom Tag. All of these things are Vom Tag. When putting the sword over the head, the main concern that I have is that and the main error I see people fall into is that their hands go too far forward. Here, right, my hands, my forearms are advanced towards the opponent. There's no piece of steel between me and his sword, so somebody can and should cut off my forearms here. I want to keep them far enough back that the hands are not a target. I don't want to, however, keep them way back over my head. This is just, first off, very tiring, and second, it sort of breaks the structure between the arm and the torso. So in order to bring this forward, I have to sort of re-engage my shoulders and then I can cut. So the rule of thumb I use when teaching this to new students is to look straight ahead, stretch your arms up over your head, and then move your sword forward enough that you can see the pommel out of your peripheral vision while looking straight ahead. Then back the sword up until you can no longer see your pommel. That's roughly the position you should be in. You may have to adjust a little bit further back depending on how long your handle is, how long your pommel is, but that's I found to be a fairly effective rule of thumb. So high Vom Tag, as we call it, here, 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 here. I should mention that when your sword is in your center line, you can keep either foot advanced. The reason for that is basically which way do you want to be able to move and cut with more facility, right? But here with my left foot advanced, sword over my head, I can cut a left Oberhau without moving. If I take a passing step, I can cut a right Oberhau very easily. Likewise, if I switch, this basically turns into sort of a less restrictive species of left Vom Tag. And that is the major advantage of keeping the sword up here. Besides the fact that I have a little bit more potential energy because my sword is just higher, and so I can bring it down, at least in theory, with greater force, assuming all of my body mechanics are equally good no matter how I am cutting. It also doesn't restrict me as much as keeping the sword on one side or the other. Here, if I want to cut a left Oberhau from my right shoulder, it can be done, but it involves some telegraphic movement. Here, that is not the case. I can cut a left Oberhau just fine, just like that, and I don't have to move my sword into position. So those are the three kind of basic variations of Vom Tag we teach beginners at Swordwind. Over the right shoulder, over the left shoulder, up over the head. Those are obviously, as I have said, and I hope it's clear by now, not the only historical Vom Tags, not the only functional Vom Tags, but the purpose of this guard, again, is to put the blade in the plane of a cut. So these are, in my opinion, the three most functional, sort of for all-around purposes, versions of the guard, and I think the most useful for practicing as a beginner to sort of internalize what the guard is good for and what it's not. I hope this has been useful for you. I'll see you next week with a new guard.